waiting for people to jump on, we can mention that tomorrow, there we go. Tomorrow we have working with sellers. So we're going to talk about working with sellers. And then on Wednesday, we have the title Old Republic. No, that's a lie. Lisa Visa from Fidelity National has brought Bob Brand to our office, and he's going to talk about how to stay out of court. So he's a attorney, and he teaches a great class on how to stay out of court. So that will be on Wednesday at 11 a.m., working with sellers on Tuesday at 11 a.m., and then Tuesday or Wednesday night at 7 p.m., we have creating a CMA. So if you want help have how to create a CMA, we'll talk about Cloud CMA and how to do that in berries and how I link them together. And the best ways to go about best practices for creating a CMA. Obviously, it doesn't always work because it all depends on where the house is located and what you've got going on. But that's going to be the plan for the week. And now that it's 11:03, I am going to get started. So welcome to our Monday Forms series. I'm going to try to keep the days of the week straight in my brain today. I know last week during Forms, I said it was Wednesday. And you know, what was really funny is I was talking to my sister on Wednesday and I said, Happy Monday. And I really thought it was Monday. So I'm just really screwed up, but that's all right. It's Forms Day on Monday, so we are talking about the seller in possession form, the SIP, the SIP, and we are also talking about the RLAS, or the residential lease after sale. So I've got the residential, if you're like, Amy, that's not the documents you just talked about. No, it's not. I have the residential purchase agreement pulled up because I just want to show you on these forms where you would find that information. So we are going to scroll down to the grid section. Here on the grid section on the, I want to say it's on the second page at the bottom down here, section M, it talks about possession. So again, we're on the RPA, the residential purchase agreement, section M, which is part of the grid on the second page. M2 talks about seller occupied or vacant units. Close of escrow date is what it defaults to. So if we don't fill out anything in this top section M1, then my buyers are going to get keys upon notice of recordation. So when we get confirmation that the property has been recorded, and they're going to occupy it on the close of escrow date at that time. That's when they're legally allowed to get keys. Now, if we wanted to change that, then we would go seller occupied or vacant units. We could check this box here if we're going to take possession after the close of escrow. Generally speaking, on vacant units, we don't take possession after the close of escrow. We usually take it on the close of escrow. It's vacant. But if something came up and you needed to, this is how you do that. Most of the time it falls under seller occupied. Okay. And the seller needs, like, maybe they're closing on another property and they need 1 week's worth of what we call rent back or seller in possession after the close of escrow, or maybe they're waiting for their transfer with the military. Maybe they're PCSing out of the area and they're like, hey, we can't move out until, I don't know what this is. It's March. So maybe they're like April 5th, right? And that would be over 29 days. So we would put here and we could put that date here. So you'd calculate how many days that is, or maybe they need 30 days after the close of escrow. So whatever that is. But here's the thing. The first box is for 29 days or fewer. And the second box is for 30 days or more. Okay. The car form SIP attached if 29 days or fewer. Car form RLAS attached if 30 days or more. So if you've got a seller that needs a 30-day rent back, I would have a conversation with the listing agent and say, hey, can we do 29 days? Okay. The reason being is that keeps it under the SIP instead of the RLAS. That's a lot less paperwork, a lot less things to disseminate and explain to your clients. It just makes it easier if you can keep it less than 29 days. That being said, if we do check the 30 days or more, then we go RLAS. Okay. So that's where these two documents come into play. So now let's scroll to those documents. We're almost there. Have to get through all the RLAS. All right, we're almost there. California consumer. All right, here we have our SIP form, which is our seller license to remain in possession addendum. This is intended for possession of 29 days or less. Okay, so if we put 29 days or less, we use this SIP form. This is an addendum to the purchase agreement or counter offer or buyer counter offer or other. So you can reference any of those. As always, in case I didn't mention it already, if you guys have questions or need me to further explain something, don't hesitate to little raise your hand there in Zoom world. You can just unmute yourself and say, hey, Amy, wait, or you can throw it in the chat box. I have all three ways identified. So feel free to do either of those ways if you have questions. You're going to put in the property address here. You're going to put in the buyer's names and the seller's names. They'll go on the top, just like every other document. Oh, I skipped the date. Here's the date, right? So it's either the purchase agreement or counter offers, and then the date. That's the date that's printed in the upper right or left-hand corner of the document in which you're referencing goes there. Okay, if you are referencing a counter offer, make sure you put which counter offer it is. Seller counter offer number 1 or buyer counter offer number 1, 2, 3, whatever it might be. This is an addendum intended to grant seller a license to remain in possession of and use the property after the close of escrow. It is intended for short-term occupancy. That would be 29 days or less. If occupancy is intended to be for 30 days or longer, parties are advised to use the residential lease after sale. Regardless of the length of time of possession, buyers advised to consult with a qualified local landlord attorney to discuss whether the possession could be interpreted as creating a landlord-tenant relationship between the buyer and seller. Note, local rent control and other law regarding tenants' rights may impact buyer and seller's rights and obligations. Close of escrow shall be day 0 for the purpose of counting days for the term of this license to remain in possession, right? So if we close escrow today is day 0, tomorrow is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 of the seller in possession. Okay. Section 1 is the term. Seller is granted a license to remain in possession of property for blank calendar days after close of escrow or to blank date. Okay, this is where we can be specific on a date or calendar days. So a lot of times sellers are like, oh, we need 10 days or 7 days after the close of escrow. We could just fill that in right here. Or if it's like that PCS example that I said, and they were like, hey, we need until April 5th, then we can come over here and we just select April 5th. Okay, so you can do either days or a specific date. Notice that when I check this box for a specific date, my ability to fill out calendar days has vanished. It doesn't let me do both. So I get to pick one or the other. Okay. The default is 6 p.m. So the seller gets to remain in possession of property for however many days or until that date, until 6 p.m. If we want to change that, we just check this box here and we put a different time here on that. Okay. So I changed it to 10 a.m. There's no wrong or right answer for that, just for the record. Seller has no right to remain in possession beyond the term and may be responsible for court-awarded damages if seller does remain. I have never had an issue with a seller moving out in my 17 years of doing real estate, and that doesn't mean that there's always time for a first. So just be aware of that, be diligent. Make sure that if you're going to grant the seller a license to remain in possession, that they have like a clear path that they're working towards on an exit. Usually, again, like I said, when we do seller in possession, they're like closing on a subsequent property. We've got somebody PCSing to another area. There's usually a reason that they need to remain in possession, not just that they don't know what they're going to do with their lives. That might be where you run into issues. So just a heads up on that. Okay, so any questions on section 1? Term. It's pretty self-explanatory. All right, in consideration for seller agreeing, section 2 is consideration. A, in consideration for seller agreeing to sell buyer and buyer agreeing to allow seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow, Seller agrees to pay buyer a non-refundable license fee for the term specified in paragraph 1 of blank per day or blank. Okay, this is where you would put in a number like $50 per day or $100 per day. Keep in mind, you can't put in 0 here. Yes, Deborah.
I was just wondering, you probably already said this, but I was transferring to my cart. Why do you call it a license?
Because we're giving them the license to remain. I don't know why they called it that. You could call legal and ask them, but that's just what they decided to call it because they're been given the ability to remain in possession.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, look, they updated the car forms. I can put in 0 here now. That's a new thing. We didn't used to be able to put that in there. So if you were doing it at no cost, multiple offer situation. The other way is that we check this box here and put at no cost. Okay. You can use this line over here so this is like a per diem, right? Per day, the little number sign. But let's say that we were just doing a flat amount. Maybe we were doing it at $1,000. We could fill in the flat amount there. So you could either do like a per diem, you could do a flat amount, or this allows you to put that you're not going to charge the sellers to remain in possession after the close of escrow. Sometimes what we do is we say, hey, it's going to be, this would also allow you to go and say buyers PITI. Okay, if you're a newer agent, you're maybe like, I've never even heard that term before. Or why would you put that on this form, Amy? This used to be common practice, right? Back before, let's go back like 5 or 6 years, right? The market's been like going up. And so it's multiple offers. So most of the time, if you've been in the business in the last few years, you're like, I'm used to giving it for free. We can charge buyers PITI. That's their principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Okay, so that's their full payment. And then we break it down. We would say buyers, usually we go buyers prorated PITI. And what that means is that we're going to charge the sellers for the days that they're in possession based on the buyer's PITI. Okay, so we're going to take the buyer's full payment, we're going to divide it by 30 days, and that's what we're going to charge them per day. Okay. If your lender's really fabulous, you could always put that in right here. If we know that we're at the final purchase price, your lender could calculate out what the buyer's PITI is, and we can put it there. Or we can put it over here. So there's a couple options there. Again, you can put no cost. You could do a flat rate. There's so many options of how you could charge a seller to stay in possession. Sometimes what we do too is we go, hey, we're going to charge them $101 per day. And we're going to say that the first 7 days, no charge. Okay, so maybe we're giving them 14 days to stay in possession there on the term on section 1. We're going to charge them $101 per day, but we're not going to charge them for that first week. Some incentive for them to get to move out. Okay, so lots of options there under consideration. The seller shall deposit such funds with escrow holder prior to the close of escrow, or such funds will be withheld from the seller's proceeds. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to buyer, or held in escrow. If seller vacates property prior to the end of the term in paragraph 1, no portion of the consideration will be returned to seller unless otherwise agreed to in writing. So this is why in this paragraph here, it's saying, hey, consideration, if we're holding any. So here is how this works. We said 14 days for the term. Okay, I'm backing up just a little bit. We said 7 days at no charge, but we're going to charge for the next 7 days. So if we take $101 times 7 days, that's $707. So based on this paragraph, at the close of escrow, we're going to withhold $707 from the seller's proceeds. Okay. And the seller, even if they move out on day 2, the buyer keeps that $707. Okay, that's what it means right here. If seller vacates the property prior to the end of the term in paragraph 1, no portion of the consideration will be returned to seller. That's why we can release the consideration to the buyer. Now, if at some point we're going to put on this document down in the other terms that seller only to be responsible for the days actually in possession, then we may want to check this box here under section 2A that says that the all consideration will be held in escrow. Okay, so if we said, hey, seller, like, we're going to charge you $101 for the second week, but if you move out at the first week, like, you can have all your money back. We just want you out of the house. Then we could say, hey, let's hold it in escrow so that escrow can release those funds back to the seller instead of my buyer having to write the seller a check or give them cash, right? It's a lot harder to get money from a buyer than it is to get money from escrow. And so oftentimes I like that those funds, if there's a potential that they're going to go back to the seller, to be held in escrow. Okay, but if we don't change anything in this paragraph, it's set up that it doesn't matter if seller moves out on day 2, 3, or 4. Buyer gets all the funds here in this paragraph. Any questions about section 2A? There's a lot in that paragraph. Okay, late charge or NSF checks, that would be non-sufficient funds. In case you're not used to writing checks, NSF would be non-sufficient funds. That would be the check gets returned because there's not enough money in the seller's account. If any payment from the seller to the buyer is required outside of escrow and any such payment is not received by buyer within 5 days after the due date, so the default is 5, we can change that. Seller shall pay to buyer an additional sum of blank dollars as a late charge. Now, keep in mind, California and most states have rules in effect of how quickly you can charge a late charge and what the max of that late charge can be. So just make sure that if you're going to fill something in there, that you are in line with the current laws. You may want to ask your buyer to double check with their landlord attorney, which it recommended that they talk to at the beginning. If a check is returned for non-sufficient funds, seller shall pay buyer a $25 as an NSF charge. Seller and buyer agree. That's the max that you can charge for a non-sufficient funds check on the first instant, just so you know. Seller and buyer agree that these charges represent a fair and reasonable estimate of the cost buyer may incur by reason of seller's late or NSF payment. Buyer's acceptance of any late charge or NSF fee shall not constitute a waiver as to any default by the seller. Okay, usually here, I don't worry about filling anything out because here's the reality. We're holding those funds from the seller's proceeds in escrow, and so it's a non-issue. Okay, but you may want to go ahead and fill something in here. Maybe halfway through the rent back, the seller's like, oh my gosh, can I stay longer, right? I need an extra week. Is that going to be okay? And your buyer's like, yeah, sure, no problem. You pay me an extra $101 per day. I'll let you stay an extra week. So if we already filled something in here, then we're good to go because now the seller's paying the buyer outside of escrow for that additional time. And if they were late on that, we just may want something filled in to cover that in case something happens. Okay. Any questions on section 2? All right. Section 3 is seller's obligations for condition of property. Maintenance. The seller shall maintain the property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, and all personal property included in the sale in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the agreement or as modified by the agreement. So this doesn't relieve them of their duties based on the purchase agreement. This is the same conditions they're supposed to leave it in the purchase agreement, carries over into the seller in possession. Except as provided in the agreement, seller shall not make any alterations to the property without buyer's written consent. And this is except as provided in the agreement. That would be like, completing any repairs as negotiated or anything else, but everything should be done with buyer's written consent. Okay. Delivery of possession, seller shall deliver the property in the condition and on the terms provided in the agreement. Delivery of possession fee. This is another really important line here, this 3C. In addition to the license fee specified in paragraph 2, that's what we're charging them per day. Seller agrees to deposit with escrow holder or such funds be withheld from seller's proceeds a delivery of possession fee in the amount of blank. I highly recommend always filling something in here. If there is furniture or appliances included with the sale of the property, you may want to make this enough that if they decide to take that fridge with them, the buyer has funds in escrow to be able to replace the fridge. Now, technically, This isn't like a damages fee. This is a delivery of possession. This is, hey, seller, I'm holding this money to make sure that you get out of the house and that you give me the keys when you're supposed to. And as long as you give me the keys like you're supposed to on the date that you're supposed to, you get this money back. So oftentimes it's somewhere between like 1,500 and 2,000. If we're like, the seller doesn't have any clear path of where they're going with their future as we're entering into escrow on this property, they're like, oh, well, the seller might need an extra 14 days to figure out where they're going to live. That sounds kind of vague. I may want to hold like $5,000 of the seller's money to ensure that they make sure they get out of that house. Okay, so you can tweak this. Oftentimes, like I said, it's usually like most people fill in, 1,500 to like 2,500 is average. I would say high side is 3, but again, under special circumstances, you may want to go higher. We're going to put in 2,000 today. Okay, at the close of escrow, this fee will be released to buyer. Okay, I really don't like my buyers handling money that's going to go back to the seller. And I don't like other people's buyers handling money that should be released back to the seller. So I'm going to say, hey, this money should be held in escrow. Okay. Within 5 days after delivery of possession to the buyer shall return the delivery of possession fee to seller if the property was delivered to buyer. Oh, it does cover damage if in the conditions specified in paragraph 3A and 3B and on the date specified in paragraph 1. So we can actually use this fund for, usually it gets used for repairs and things that go missing, but I've always read it as a delivery of possession fee. So that's why we read these forms, because here this is going to get returned to the seller, assuming that the condition is specified in paragraphs 3A or 3B. That's the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the contract. Okay. And as long as they do it in the as time specified in paragraph 1. Okay. I like to hold it in escrow. That way the buyer and the seller don't end up in a legal dispute in 3 months because the buyer refuses to give the seller money back, or they failed to do it in the time specified, or whatever it is. We just like to hold it in escrow. Okay, that's section 3A, B, and C. Any questions about sections 1, 2, or 3? Okay, section 4, utilities. Seller agrees to pay for all utilities and any related utility services and the following charges. So a lot of times we leave that blank. They're going to pay for all their current utilities. That means your buyer's not going to start utilities until the date that the delivery of possession is supposed to happen. Okay. Entry is section 5. Seller shall make property available to buyer for the purpose of entering to make any necessary or agreed repairs, or to supply necessary or agreed services, or to show property to prospective or actual purchasers, tenants, mortgagees, lenders, appraisers, or contractors. Buyer and seller agree that 24-hour notice, oral or written, shall be reasonable and sufficient notice. In an emergency, buyer may enter the property at any time without prior notice. Buyer may not remove personal property may not move personal property into property without prior written consent from the seller. Okay, so entry follows a lot of tenant guidelines, 24-hour notice, and then also keep in mind that it's for the purpose of making necessary or agreed to repairs, supplying necessary or agreed to services to the seller, or to show the property. So if you've got a landlord or an investor that purchased this property to rent it out, they can start showing that property to prospective tenants. Okay, or if they're going to put it back on the market and resell it for higher, they can do that as well. They can also show it to contractors. So if they're trying to get quotes or different things, that all falls underneath that paragraph. Got to give 24-hour notice. Any questions about sections 4 or 5? All right, section 6 is keys and other items included. Seller shall provide keys and other items necessary to access property as required in the agreement at close of escrow, or if checked at the end of the term of the seller license to remain in possession. Oftentimes I check this box here so that, and then we just agree that we're going to leave copies of the keys in the lockbox in case there is an emergency. Rather than the buyer getting keys and then having to make sure the seller has a copy of them. So oftentimes I just check it that, hey, The buyer's going to actually get the keys at the end when the seller actually moves out. That's what that box means. If we don't check that box, buyer gets keys on close of escrow. Okay, other items included in the agreement shall be provided at the end of the term of the seller license to remain in possession. That's going to be things like your refrigerators, your sheds, your washers and dryers. If you negotiated furniture with the sale, yes, you can do that. It would all be at the end. So possession of that stuff happens at the end of the seller license to remain in possession. Assignment or subletting. Seller shall not assign or sublet any whole or any part of the property or assign or transfer this license to remain in possession of the property. Any assignment, subletting, or transfer of the property by voluntary act of the seller by operation of law or otherwise without buyer's prior written consent shall give buyer the right to terminate seller's license to remain in possession. So ultimately, we're giving the seller the ability to remain in possession, not anybody else. They can't move out and give that second week to somebody else. No, nothing like that. Okay. Insurance, seller's personal property, including vehicles, is not insured by buyer. And if applicable, not by the owner's association against loss or damage due to fire, theft, vandalism, rain wire, criminal, or negligent acts of others or any other cause. Seller is advised to carry seller's own insurance to protect seller from such loss and contact its own insurance carrier to discuss available options. Okay, insurance is an important one. The buyer's going to have their homeowner's insurance go into effect on the day of the close of escrow with their insurance carrier. They want to contact their insurance carrier and let them know that, hey, we're closing escrow on April 1st and the seller's remaining in possession until April 5th. I just wanted to make you aware in case I need to have a landlord policy in place during those first 5 days. Okay, so a landlord policy is different than a homeowner's policy. So we may want to make sure that your buyer checks with their insurance company on what they need to do for that time period. Oftentimes the seller doesn't go out and get a rental policy for those 5 days or those 7 days or those 14 days. Oftentimes they just leave their homeowner's insurance in place for that time period. I don't know if that would actually cover them because they're not technically the homeowners. So if you have a seller, you may want to advise them that they reach out to their insurance carrier. They cancel their homeowner's insurance and they do put into effect renter's insurance for the time that they'll be in the house after the close of escrow. Just some things to keep in mind. Waiver. Number 9, the waiver or breach of any breach shall not be construed as a continuing waiver of the same or subsequent breach. So if we waive and we say, oh, it's okay, you brought somebody else into the house, that doesn't mean that they can continue bringing other people into the house to rent it. Okay, other conditions or supplements here on line item 10. This would be where we could put like seller only to pay 4 days actually in possession. POSSP. Possession days not used will be refunded to seller upon delivery of possession, right? So we could put that in there. We could add that clause to our clause library, right? So we could go in there and add it in there to our clause library if we wanted that, so that it'd be really easy just to go click on it and pull it up. Super simple there. We can go clauses, create a clause. We're going to call it SIP Pro rated refund, and then I'm going to go boom and hit save. So now if I didn't have this here, I could go in here and go add a clause, go into my personal clauses, click on this one, hit insert, and then it plugs that sentence in there for me. So if there's anything that you're ever using on a regular basis on these forms, just come right over here on your right hand side, hit the clause button, hit create a clause, paste that into that, name it, and then that way it's always available for you to pull up without having to type it each and every time. So super cool feature of the new forms editor that we're using. I mean, that we've been using for a while, but if you weren't using it for a while, that's one of the features. All right. Regardless of the length of time of possession as originally agreed, if buyer and seller intend to extend the SIP beyond 29 days from close of escrow, buyer and seller are advised to consult with a qualified local landlord-tenant attorney regarding whether a landlord-tenant relationship may inadvertently be created. By signing below, buyer and seller acknowledge that each has read, understands, and received a copy of and agrees to the terms of the seller license to remain in possession. Addendum, buyer sign, seller sign. Any question on the SIP form? Seller license to remain in possession addendum. This one's only 2 pages. It's much simpler and then our RLAS, which we will go ahead and move on to. So again, if our seller is going to remain in possession for 30 days or more, then we use the RLAS, residential lease after sale. Seller in possession after the close of escrow, intended for possession of 30 or more days. So keep in mind that this is different than your normal like residential lease. This is specifically designed for the seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow. Here's where you're going to put today's date. We're going to put the seller's name, the buyer's name. Have entered into a purchase agreement for the real property described below. Close of escrow for the purchase agreement is scheduled to occur on this date. So we're going to put whatever the scheduled close of escrow date is. I'm going to put March. Oh, that doesn't work. It's a Sunday. We should at least be realistic. March 29th. Buyer as housing provider and seller as tenant agrees to the following. Housing provider rents to tenant and tenant rents from housing provider the real property and improvements described as. Here's where you're going to put the full property address. And because I haven't mentioned it yet today, please make sure that you put the suffix of the street, whether it's a street, drive, court, lane, it all needs to be on there. So you're going to put 123 Sample Street, Vacaville, California, 95688, right? The full address. The premises are for the sole use as a personal residence by the following named persons only. So this is usually where I put sellers and sellers, not possessive, sellers and sellers immediate family only, right? If they have like kids or anything like that, then that would cover the kids, or if their mom lives with them, that would cover that. Okay. So I usually specify that. I can't get off this box. It's frozen. Seller and seller's immediate family only. Once we can get the box to go away, there we go. All right. Any persons in the premises other than those listed in this paragraph are considered guests. Guests are not permitted to stay more than 14 days without housing provider's written consent. You may want to shore that up and put, hey, they can stay 3 days. Or, hey, no guests that stay longer than 1 day without housing providers, right? So you may want to change that up. If we're like, hey, well, this is for 30 days or more, so it allows them to stay for that. So, right, so we're allowing people to come stay with them. Maybe it's a week. Who knows? It's up to you. Personal property listed in the purchase agreement maintained pursuant to paragraph 11 is included. Okay, we haven't gotten to paragraph 11 yet, but this is for personal property. Any questions on the top or section 1 of the RLAS? All right, section 2 is the term. The term begins on the day after the close of escrow of the purchase and sale agreement, the commencement date. So remember, our day 0 for our SIP was on the close of escrow. That's day 0. This one begins the day after the close of escrow and shall terminate blank calendar days after the close of escrow or on blank date at 6 p.m. or we can change the time. So here we would say like it's going to be 31 days, or maybe it's just 30. Remember, this is for 30 days. Okay, so 30 days after the close of escrow at 6 p.m. Maybe we want to change this to 10 a.m. Whatever you want to do there, you can tweak it however you want to. Or if there was a specific day, we can take that out. We would check this box, and then we might be like, we close on the 31st, and they're staying through the 5th of May, right? So you've got options there of how to identify the term. Tenant shall vacate premises upon termination of this agreement unless housing provider and tenant have signed a new agreement, right? Mandated by any rent increase cap or just cause eviction control under any state or local law, or housing provider accepts rent from tenant other than past due rent, in which case a month-to-month tenancy shall be created, which either party may terminate pursuant to California Civil Code 1946.1. Rent shall be at a rate agreed to by housing provider and tenant or as allowed by law. All other terms and conditions of this agreement shall remain in full force and effect. Okay, so hey, it's going to terminate on this date. If the buyer needs or the seller needs additional time and they work that out with the buyer directly, they should have a new written agreement identifying what that rent is going to be and the time period for which that's going to take place. Otherwise, if we agree on a term and a price for the rent, and then the seller's like, oh, I need more time, and they pay the buyer additional rent money for that additional time, and the buyer accepts it, we've now created a month-to-month tenancy. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Section 3, escrow payments. Check all that apply. The security deposit, first month's rent, rent for the entire lease, if lease term is at least 6 months, or other per escrow instructions shall be paid out of seller's proceeds from escrow for the purchase of the premise. So normally we hold everything out of the seller's proceeds. So it's usually like, hey, security deposit, first month's rent, or rent for the entire lease term if lease is at least 6 months, or other. Okay, so you've got some options there, but normally at least security deposit and first month's rent per escrow instructions shall be paid out of seller's proceeds. Okay, so that's escrow payments. That's, hey, we're holding it from the seller's funds, not the seller's going to come to the buyer directly with additional funds. Rent is section 4. Any questions so far? All right. Rent shall mean any monetary obligations of tenant to housing provider under the terms of this agreement, except security deposit. Tenant agrees to pay per month blank for the term of the agreement. So here's where you could say, hey, we're going to pay $2,400 per month for the term of the agreement. Rent is payable in advance on the first or blank day each calendar month and is delinquent on the next day. So, right, so there's options here. If it's the rent's payable on the first, then we're counting the months as like the first through the end of the month. And if we close on the 15th, then we've got this additional time. So you maybe want to be like, hey, rent's due payable on the 15th, and we're just going to run it the 15th to the 15th because our close of escrow is scheduled for the 15th. So you decide how you want to tweak that, or have your buyer decide how they want to run that. You could always do prorated rent for the current month and then keep the rent for the first month. So you've got options there as well. The amount the tenant or the seller pays per month is going to be something that's got to be agreeable between your buyer and the seller. There's lots of options there. You could pull up like market rent for the property. You could charge buyer's PITI. That would be the best option unless buyer's PITI is less than market rent. Then I would go market rent. But buyer's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, I'd find out what their mortgage payment is going to be. And ultimately, you really want the seller covering their mortgage payment. Okay. If commencement date falls on any other day, then the day rent is payable under section 4B, right? The first, the tenant has paid 1 full month's rent in advance of commitment date. Rent for the second calendar month shall be prorated based on the 30-day period. Okay, so it's just saying, hey, it's going to be prorated. Rent shall be paid by personal check, money order, cashier's check, or through escrow. How are we taking care of that? Most of the time, if we've checked this up here this first month, we go through escrow. We can also wire or electronic payment, or let's say that they were going to stay in possession for like 5 months, and we could always put in here Venmo, right? Or maybe we're putting Zelle. Like, how does the buyer want their rent funds after that first month? So make sure you put it in there so that it's specified. And, or you could just go, we want it all paid through escrow, which means they pay the escrow holder. Okay, so there's lots, you can check more than one too. You can be like, hey, we would accept personal check, cashier's check, Venmo, through escrow. I don't want you wiring funds to my account, so that's there. Payment via electronic apps, PayPal or Venmo will not be accepted or will be accepted, right? So it's got that added little verbiage in there for that. So you can specify what you want and that would be accepted. Rent shall be delivered to, here's where you're going to put the buyer's name, the buyer's phone number, and the address at which the seller can go and pay rent. Okay, where's the buyer going to be living? If you're like, gosh, the buyer's not going to be living anywhere, then we want it through escrow. Okay, but it could be personal check or cashier's check or wired electronic payment through escrow. We can specify, we can clarify down later on that all payments are to be made through escrow if we don't want to give the buyer's address out. Okay, or you could give like the office address, so you could put our address there, which means that poor Carly's going to have to log that rent check and to our trust account, and then when the buyer comes and picks up, she's going to have to log it out of the trust account. But we can do that. We can do that. Okay. Or at any other location subsequently specified by housing provider in writing to tenant. So the buyer can always give the tenant notice that here's where I want you delivering rent in the future. And if checked, rent may be paid personally between the hours of blank and blank on the following days, right? So if we want to make sure we clarify when rent's going to be accepted, we would check that box there and say, hey, it's due between 9 and 4. We want to make sure somebody's in the office Monday through Friday, right? So we could specify that there on section 2. If it's going to a personal address, then it may be like, hey, anytime to that address works. And this would be mainly if it's like being mailed. So, right. So up here, it's assuming that it's going to be mailed or it's going to be paid personally between the hours. So you can set business hours. If any payment is returned for non-sufficient funds or because the tenant stops payment, then after that, housing provider may in writing require tenant to pay rent in cash for 3 months, and all future rent may be paid by money order or cashier's check. Right. You could check both if you wanted to. Sometimes people can scam money orders, though. I'd probably go cashier's check, although those can be scammed too, but less likely. So, and this is just saying that, hey, if we have a non-sufficient funds or a stop payment on one of your checks, then I can require you to pay cash for 3 months. And after that, I'm no longer accepting personal checks. We're only taking cashier's check. Okay. Rent payments received by housing provider shall be applied to the earliest amounts due or past due. It's just saying that, hey, if there's a past due amount, it goes there first. Any questions about section 4, rent? Okay, security deposit. Tenant agrees to pay blank as a security deposit. In general, the maximum allowable security deposit is 2 times the monthly rent in paragraph 4A. If the property is provided unfurnished, and 3 times the rent if the property provided furnished is 3 times the rent if provided furnished with housing provider's personal property. Okay, so this could max at, our rent was $2,400, so that would be $4,800 would be the max. Sometimes our security deposits are the same, sometimes more than the rent. Okay. If the buyer purchased the house with all the property, that now becomes a furnished rental because the buyer has purchased all the property. So keep that in mind. Then they could charge 3 times. If security deposit exceeds the amount, buyer, housing provider, and seller tenant are advised to discuss with a qualified California real estate attorney. Security deposit will be paid by personal check, money order, cashier's check, or through escrow. Wire or electronic payments or other. Security deposit will be transferred and held by the owner of the premise or held in the broker's trust account. So we need to select one. What's the security deposit going to do? Okay, is it going to be held in our broker's trust account, or is it going to be transferred or held by the owner of the premise? Okay. B, all or any portion of the security deposit may be used as reasonably necessary to cure tenant's default in payment of rent, which includes late charges, non-sufficient fund fees, or other sums due. Repair damage, excluding ordinary wear and tear caused by tenant or by a guest, invitee, or licensee of the tenant. Cleaned premise, if necessary, upon termination of tenancy, and replace or return personal property appurtenances. Security deposit shall not be used by tenant in lieu of payment for last month's rent. Okay, so the tenant can't just be like, well, you've got my security deposit, I don't have to pay rent. If all or any portion of the security deposit is used during tenancy, tenant agrees to reinstate the total security deposit within 5 days after written notice is delivered to tenant. Within 21 days after tenant vacates the premise, housing provider shall. So that's just saying that, hey, if you were past due on rent and we use part of the security deposit to cure your default on your late rent and cover the NSF fee or cover the late fee, then tenant, you need to fulfill and refill that deposit up to its full amount. Okay. The tenant can't go, well, you've got money there in my deposit to pay for the late rent amount, so I'm not going to pay it. Okay. 21 days after tenant vacates, within 21 days, housing provider, so that's the buyer, shall furnish tenant an itemized statement including the amount of any security deposit received and the basis for its disposition and supporting documents as required by California Civil Code, and return any remaining portion of the security deposit to tenant. So just like normal tenants' rights, within 21 days after they vacate, the buyer needs to, if they're like, oh my gosh, you destroyed the wall and punched holes in it and we had to repair it, the buyer has to, they can take that from the security deposit, but they have to show what they paid from the security deposit and proof. So they need some receipts right there to provide with that, to give to the seller to show them why they're not returning the full deposit. Okay, the rest of it gets returned. Security deposit will not be returned until all tenants have vacated the premises and all keys returned. Any security deposit returned by check shall be made out to all tenants named on this agreement or as subsequently modified. So if we're returning that security deposit via check, it should be made out to all the sellers that are listed on this agreement. No interest will be paid on security deposit unless required by local law. And E, if the security deposit is held by owner, tenant agrees not to hold broker responsible for its return. If the security deposit is held in owner's broker's trust account and broker's authority is terminated before expiration of this agreement and security deposit is released to someone other than the tenant, then broker shall notify tenant in writing where and to whom the security deposit has been released. Once tenant has been provided such notice, tenant agrees to not hold the broker responsible for the security deposit. Ooh, any questions on section 5? Security deposit. This is why I say, hey, people, keep it at 29 days or less. All right, section 6, late charges and return checks. Tenant acknowledges either late payment or return of issuance of a return. Tenant acknowledges either late payment of rent or issuance of a returned check. Insufficient funds may cause housing provider to incur costs and expenses, the exact amounts of which are extremely difficult and impractical to determine. These costs may include, but are not limited to, processing, enforcement, and accounting expenses, and late charges imposed on housing provider if any installment of rent due from tenant is not received by the housing provider within 5 calendar days after date due, or if a check is returned. Tenant shall pay housing provider respectively an additional sum of blank or blank percent. So we can either go with a flat fee of like $125, or we could say, hey, we're due 3% of the rent due as a late charge. Okay, so you can go either or. And make sure you know what the maximums are allowed by law so you don't exceed that. And $25 as an NSF for the first return check and $35 as a non-sufficient funds fee for each additional return check, either of both or both of which shall be deemed additional rent. So keep in mind, if the tenant, the seller pays rent and the check bounces, there's not funds, and we get a returned check, which then causes their payment to be late, they're going to get both a non-sufficient funds fee and they're going to get the late fee. They're going to get both. Okay, and we can charge that $25 for the first NSF fee. Any additional return checks get a $35 fee. Housing provider, 6B, housing provider and tenant agree that these charges represent fair and reasonable estimate of the cost housing providers may incur by reason of tenant's late or NSF payment. Any late charge or NSF fee due shall be paid with the current installment of rent. Housing provider's acceptance of any late charge or NSF fee shall not constitute a waiver as to the default of tenant. Housing provider's right to collect a late charge or NSF fee shall neither be deemed an extension of the date rent is due under paragraph 3, nor prevent housing provider from exercising any other rights and remedies under this agreement as provided by law. Okay. 7 is parking, check A or B, so one or the other. Parking is permitted as follows. That would be like in garage, G-A-R-A-G-A-R, or driveway, right? We don't want them parking in the lawn. The right to park is included in the rent charged pursuant to paragraph 4. This would be like if there was a separate, if you lived in the city and there was a separate fee for a parking permit or something, then we'd say, hey, it's not included. So, right, wherever it is. Pursuant to paragraph 4, if not included in rent, the parking rental fee shall be an additional $200 per month. We don't include this very often because we don't run into this very often. Parking spaces are to be used only for parking properly registered and operable motor vehicles, except for trailers, boats, campers, buses, or trucks, other than pickup trucks. Tenants shall park in assigned spaces only. Parking spaces are to be kept clean. Vehicles leaking oil, gas, or other motor vehicle fluids shall not be parked on the premises. Mechanical work or storage of inoperable vehicles or storage of any kind is not permitted in the parking spaces or elsewhere on the premise except as specified in paragraph 8. Or parking is not permitted on the real property of which the premise is a part. So we're either going to mark A, parking is permitted as following, or there's no parking at the property. Okay, those are your two options. Most of the time, for what we're going to encounter in like Solano County, it's going to be, hey, parking can be in garage or driveway. You could say driveway or along the street if you so desire, but that's not technically owned by the seller. So usually it's garage or driveway. They can choose to park in the street. And most of the time it is included in the rent. So that's usually what I put there. Storage is permitted as follows. Now keep in mind that we just set up here that we can't like store inoperable vehicles. Let's see, parking spaces, registered and operable motor vehicles, and we've excluded trailers, boats, campers, buses, and trucks. So if the seller has a trailer, boat, camper, bus, or truck, we may want to specify here that camper is permitted in RV parking area, right? So we may want to specify that so that the seller stays in compliance with the contract. So just kind of keep that in mind that we've excluded that, or if they have a vehicle that's not working that they're going to have towed to their new property, we may want to specify that that inoperable vehicle can be stored on the property. But usually it's storage permitted as follows. Usually I just put anywhere on property. Okay, we could store things anywhere on property. If we specify the camper, then we might want to put other storage can be anywhere on property, right? So we may want to specify there. The right to separate storage is or is not included. So like, is this a condo that has a separate storage unit? Then we may want to include or not include. So there we go. The B here, right? So if we don't fill in anything up here, boom, other store. Oh, I deleted the wrong spot. There we go. Storage is permitted as follows. We could go or B. I don't know why we don't have boxes here. There should be check boxes, except for tenant's personal property contained entirely within the premise. Storage is not permitted on the premise. That's just saying, hey, personal property can be stored, nothing else. Ta-da! Okay, but if we want to include the camper and the RV, we would put it up here. Utilities. Tenant agrees to pay for all utility services in the following charges. So again, that's the same as like the SIP. Utility state in the responsibility of the seller who stays in possession. Or as agreed on a separate addendum, if any utilities are not separately metered, tenant shall pay tenant's proportional share as reasonably determined and directed by housing provider. Housing provider is only responsible for installing and maintaining one usable phone jack and one telephone line to premise. Okay. So keep in mind too, that we just said that we're including a telephone jack. Okay. Water submeters, water use on the premise is measured by a submeter, and tenant will be separately billed for water usage based on the submeter. See attached water submeter addendum. There's no submeter. For most part, on a normal house, you're just paying for all utilities. Gas meter, the premise does not have a separate gas meter, or electric meter. The premise does not have a separate electric meter. So this would be like multifamily, where maybe you have an ADU and a regular, maybe the seller's staying in possession of the ADU and there's not a separate gas meter. We would mark it here. Okay. Condition of the premise. Tenant has examined premise, and if any old furniture, furnishings, appliances, landscaping, and fixtures, including smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors that are owned by housing provide, and if any, tenant acknowledges that these items are in the condition disclosed and agreed to be delivered in the purchase agreements. Tenant acknowledges that these items are clean and in operable condition with the following exceptions. So if there's something that's not working, we note it there. For the most part, it's probably going to be A, tenant acknowledges that these items are in the condition disclosed and agreed to be delivered in the purchase agreement. Tenant acknowledgement of the condition of these items contained in the attached statement of conditions. That's CAR form MII. Housing provider will deliver to tenant a statement of condition, CAR form MII, within 3 days after execution of this agreement prior to commencement date. Within 3 days after commencement date, tenant shall complete and return the MII to housing provider within 3 days after delivery. Tenant's failure to return the MII within that time frame shall conclusively be deemed tenant's acknowledgement of the condition as stated in the MII. So for the most part, we're probably going to check A, that, hey, everything's in the same condition as the agreement specified. Okay. There's still F, other. Maintenance, use, and reporting. Tenant shall properly use, operate, and safeguard premise, including, if applicable, any landscaping, furniture, furnishings, and appliances, and all mechanical, electrical, gas, and plumbing fixtures, carbon monoxide detectors, and smoke alarms, and keep them and the premise clean, sanitary, and well ventilated. Tenant shall be responsible for any additional phone lines beyond the one line and jack that the housing provider shall provide and maintain. Tenant shall replace any burned out or malfunctioning light bulbs. Tenant shall immediately notify housing provider in writing of any problem, malfunction, damage with any item, including carbon monoxide detectors and smoke alarms on the property. Tenant shall be charged for all repairs or replacements caused by tenant, pets, guests, or licensees of the tenant, excluding ordinary wear and tear. Tenant shall be charged for all damage to the premise as a result of failure to report a problem in a timely manner. Tenant shall be charged for repair of drain blockages or stoppages unless caused by defective plumbing parts or tree roots invading the sewer lines. Housing provider, tenant, or HOA shall water the garden, landscaping, trees, and shrubs. So usually we're going to say that the tenant is going to be responsible for maintaining the garden, landscaping, trees, and shrubs. Okay, but it could be HOA if the HOA maintains it, or it could be the housing provider is going to come over and do it. Okay, so make sure you check a box there. But this is just saying that, hey, this is the way that you're going to use the property. Any questions so far? All right, 11 B was the watering. 11C is housing provider, tenant, or HOA shall maintain garden, landscaping, and trees except. So this could be like HOA shall water the garden, trees, landscaping, except back yard area. And then it might be the tenant is going to maintain the garden, landscaping, except front yard area, right? So if there's an HOA that is in charge of the sprinklers and the maintenance of the landscaping in the front, this specifies that, hey, the HOA is going to take care of the front and tenant's going to take care of the back. Housing provider or tenant shall maintain. So there's a blank line there for D in case you want to utilize that line. You don't have to. Housing provider and tenant agree that state or local water use restrictions shall supersede any obligation of housing provider or tenant to water or maintain any garden, landscaping, trees, shrubs pursuant to paragraphs 11B, 11C, and 11D. Tenant's failure to maintain any item for which the tenant is responsible shall give housing provider the right to hire someone to perform such maintenance and charge tenant to cover the costs of such maintenance. personal property belonging to the seller at the close of escrow of the purchase of the premise, and the following items are included in the premise without warranty, and housing provider will not maintain, repair, or replace them except. So that's like if the fridge was bought with the purchase, then it's going to stay in the property until the buyer takes possession. So while the seller still remains in possession, and it's without warranty and there's no guarantee that it's going to work. And if the fridge stops working during the tenancy, the seller does not, or the buyers do not have an obligation to replace that. Tenant understands that the premise is located in a common interest development. Housing provider may not have the authority or control over certain parts of the premise, such as roof, electrical, gas, or plumbing features in certain walls and common areas, such as shared parking, structure, or garage. Tenant shall not use the premise to plant, grow, cultivate, or sell marijuana except. Okay, so if they already have a grow room going, you probably need to specify that. Otherwise, just leave it alone. Okay, section 11. Any questions? Okay, section 12, neighborhood conditions. Tenant is advised to satisfy himself or herself as to the neighborhood and area conditions, including but not limited to schools, proximity and adequacy of law enforcement, crime statistics, proximity of registered felons and offenders, telecommunications and other technology services and installations, proximity to commercial, industrial, and agricultural activities, existing or proposed transportation, construction, and development that may affect noise, view, or traffic, airport noise, or odor from any source, wild or domestic animals, other nuisances, hazards, or circumstances, cemeteries, facilities, condition of common areas, conditions and influences of significant or certain cultures and or religions, and personal needs, requirements, and preferences of tenant. Tenant should already know about the property because they've been living there. So that shouldn't be an issue, but it does state it in there. Pets, unless otherwise provided in California Civil Code 54.2 or other law, no animal or pet should be kept on or about the premise without housing provider's prior written consent. If they already have animals, we want to check this box here, except as agreed to in the attached animal terms and conditions addendum, the ATCA. Okay, so if they have pets, check the box. If they don't have pets, you don't have to check that box. We don't want the seller to have to get rid of their pets for the 2 months that they're going to remain in possession of the property. That's probably not realistic. Smoking. Tenant is responsible for all damage caused by smoking after the close of escrow and during the term of this agreement. Any prior damage that has been accounted for in the purchase agreement shall not be deducted from the security deposit. The premise and of common areas may be subject to local non-smoking ordinance. No smoking of any substance is allowing on the premise or common areas. If smoking does occur on the premise or common areas, tenant is in material breach of this agreement. Tenant, guests, and others may be required to leave the premise. Smoking of the following substances only is allowed. So if the seller is a cigarette smoker, you may want to check this box and say cigarettes only, right? So there's some options there. That was interesting that it unchecked that box up there. So tenant's responsible for the damage. There may be non-smoking rules in place in the common areas, and there's no smoking on the premise of any kind. Okay, this is just saying that, hey, if there was smoking, that you're responsible for the damages. Or we can say smoking of the following substances allowed and fill out that line item. 15 is rules and regulations. Tenant agrees to comply with all housing provider rules and regulations that are at any time posted on the premise or delivered to tenant. Tenant shall not ensure that guests, invitees, and licensees of tenant shall not disturb, annoy, endanger, or interfere with other tenants of the building or neighbors, or a use of the premise, or any unlawful purposes under federal, state, or local law, including but not limited to using, manufacturing, selling, storing, transporting illicit drugs or other contraband, or violate any law or ordinance, or commit a waste nuisance on or about the premise. Okay. B is, if applicable, check 1, housing provider shall provide tenant with a copy of rules and regulations within blank days, or tenant has been provided and acknowledges receipt of a copy of rules and regulations. So if you're going to give them additional rules and regulations, we want to check one of those boxes. If it's a condo or planned unit development, we're going to check this box here on 16, saying that it's a part. If not, we don't check box 16. The premise are a unit in a condominium plan unit development, common interest subdivision, or other development governed by the homeowners association. The name of the HOA is blank. You're going to fill that out. Tenant agrees to comply with all HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, bylaw rules, regulations, and decision HOA rules. Tenant shall reimburse housing provider for any fines or charges imposed by the HOA or other authorities due to any violation by tenant or the guests or licensees of the tenant or housing provider. Shall have the right to deduct such amounts from the security deposit. Tenant acknowledges already having a copy of the HOA rules. We're assuming that they have a copy because they live there already. Alterations and repairs, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 24C, without housing provider's prior written consent, tenant shall not make any repairs, alterations, improvements in or about the premise, including painting, wallpapering, adding or changing locks, installing antennas or satellite dishes, placing signs, displays, or exhibits, or using screws, fastening devices, large nails, or adhesive materials. Housing provider shall not be responsible for the cost of alterations or repairs made by tenant. Tenant shall not deduct from rent the cost of any repairs, alterations, or improvements, and any deduction made by the tenant shall be considered unpaid rent. I'm going to finish section 18, and then we're going to finish the rest of this next week during our terms, because we still have another several pages to go of the RLAS. So let's finish section 18. We're almost halfway there. Keys, locks, and items included. Tenant acknowledges possession of blank: keys to the premise, keys to the mailbox, keys to the common areas, remote control devices for garage door gate openers. If you're like Amy, I have no idea what to put here, I would check on the TDS, the transfer disclosure statement, because it discloses how many keys the seller said they had to the premise, and I would put the same number there, and the same number there, and the same number there, and the same number there. I would make it match. That way it's in concordance with what the seller already disclosed they had to the property, and that we don't have to go make copies. Tenant acknowledges that locks to the premise have not been rekeyed. Okay, if we check this box, they have been rekeyed. We probably want to wait to have that rekeyed until the buyer actually takes possession. If tenant rekeys existing locks or opening devices, tenant shall immediately deliver copies of all keys to housing provider. Tenant shall pay all costs and charges related to loss of any keys or opening devices. Tenant may not remove locks, even if installed by tenant. Tenant shall provide housing provider keys and other items necessary to access property as required in the purchase agreement at close of escrow or at the end of the residential lease after sale. Okay, so oftentimes we check this after, but because this is a longer period, we may want to make sure that the buyer does have a copy of the keys. So we may just leave that one as the default, unlike with the SIP. Items included, other items included in the purchase agreement shall be provided at the end of the residential lease after sale. Any questions up to section 18 through section 18? All right, fabulous. It is 12:10, so we will finish this training next week. We also have, let me see what I've got next week. The statewide buyer and seller advisory, the market conditions advisory, and the WDA. I think that's, I can't think of what the WDA is. So I should be able to finish this and cover those. I'm not going to read the SBSA line by line. We're just going to go over what that form is, how do you utilize it, and when you should utilize it. So we will pick up on section 19 next Monday, and we will finish up in the 8-page RLAS. Again, I highly recommend keeping your sellers in possession at 29 days or less to use that SIP form. That's only 2 pages. Any questions before we wrap up today?
No, ma'am. Is there a sign in or no?
There is no sign in today. We are sign in free.
Yay.
Yeah, that's what happens when you put me in charge of things. You are welcome, Daniel and Deborah. I hope you guys have a fabulous day. And like I said, we'll pick back up on section 19 next week. We will see you tomorrow for working with sellers.